Hi there, my name is Chris Sessums. I am Director of Academic Affairs at D2L, and welcome to Between Two Moose, a place where we get to discuss topics and trends related to teaching and learning with technology. And today we're going to be talking about student engagement. But before we get there, I'd like to introduce the cheese in my cheese omelet, the crunch in my Captain Crunch, Ken Chapman, the Vice President of Market Research. I almost demoted you to Director. Sorry, Ken. Market Research. So today we're going to talk about student engagement. The original title of our show was The Party's Over. What do you do with how you keep students engaged at this stage in the semester? But before we get there, Ken, I first thought it would be fun to think about defining what is student engagement and why is it important? Do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I mean, there's so many ways that we can think about it. I mean, there's the there's kind of the soulless way of looking at it and thinking about, well, how engaged are students in logging into our environments, showing up to the things that we're doing and participating at some level in the activities, the learning activities that we've defined. There's value and there's use in thinking about engagement at that level, but I think what we're ultimately trying to achieve is a higher order personal connection. For me and from the educators I've talked to that have really resonated, engagement is when you really connect with somebody at a personal level and they're interacting with and aligned with the learning content or the objectives in some way that maps to an area of interest to them, a personal experience, or just captures their attention so that their learning becomes more of eustress, the positive stress of wanting to improve and get better, rather than distress, where you've got the injection of cortisol and the friction in yourself. So when I think about engagement, I try to think of those ways that you can create those goosebump opportunities, where there's a challenge or problem ahead, but one where there's a level of excitement or energy that comes with it.
No, I like where you're going with that, Ken. Some of the things I did a little research on student engagement, and there's also, as you've noted, kind of psychological connections to keeping students engaged. There's even issues of like locus of control, right? Mm-hmm. Whether students feel like they're in control or something exterior is controlling them. There's issues of self-worth, right, tied to engagement, and value. In other words, is my engagement, are the efforts that I'm putting forward, are they paying off? Am I being rewarded by those? Right. So I think that's really, really critical things to sort of think about. Other definitions I've looked at of student engagement have focused on the greater the students involved in their academic work or in the academic experiences leads to greater knowledge acquisition, greater cognitive development. So, but two other things I just want to point out quickly. Things that I found interesting about looking at engagement is that it's individually referenced. The idea is that what works for me might not work for you, which is kind of an interesting concept to think about as well. And that it's a multi-directional partnership. That is, it's going to take us, two of us at least, in order to sort of have some levels of engagement. So those are some thoughts I had about that.
And it doesn't happen by accident, or if it does, that's quite the random occurrence. And to the title of our Between Two Moose episode, welcome by the way, that you mentioned, if how to keep the party going. Congratulations if you got the party started in the first place. So Chris, what are some of the things that educators need to think of, particularly when they're teaching online, to initiate that connection, to embrace that individuality? If you're going to achieve engagement, you have to think about the diversity of your constituents.
There's a couple things, Ken, that immediately strike me about that, and I'm glad you asked. First is this idea of communication. I think that it's really critical that faculty members and teachers are communicating their expectations around student engagement and And most importantly, is that they're modeling this level of student engagement. I think it's really hard to ask students to be engaged, involved in the activities if the faculty member is not involved.
Mm-hmm.
So
what does that look like?
Those are the first couple of things. But one of the things that, and this goes back to our first episode of Between Two Moose, thinking about the discussion board. In online courses, oftentimes the discussion board is maybe one of the places where most of the quote unquote engagement is taking place in those asynchronous kinds of environments. But I was thinking about an example that occurred for me when I required students to not do the same thing that they've always done. So in an online course, typically early on, I say, introduce yourself on the discussion board and tell us why you're taking this course or so on. Well, online students get that practically in every course. And if they've been taking courses together, they hate that activity. At least my students have told me, don't make us do that. So I started asking students to say, tell me 3 things that we would never know about you. And I want you to use video instead of writing it down.
Right. And
that changed the game, Ken. Changed the game. Because all of a sudden students are feeling like, oh, I've got to turn the camera on. Uh-oh, I've got to think about what I'm saying. And they said, many of my students said, I thought I would just hit record and off I went. And ended up going, no, wait, scratch that. I got to do it again. And had to practice thinking about how they were portraying themselves. I thought it was really fascinating.
Yeah, I mean, there's a higher level of engagement just by virtue of us being present on video. I'm in a very literal way presenting myself. So the engagement there with the ideas that I'm communicating and the representation of myself is that much stronger. Absolutely. I've even heard some instructors have done some interesting things to talk to their students about, well, where do you in your own time, where do you go and consume content? Where do you find yourself, down the rabbit hole because you are so engaged and you're looking at things? So some really engaged instructors are doing things like recognizing their students are on Twitch or Mixer or on streaming platforms, and they're delivering little micro lessons out through some of those different channels that they may not have thought about before, but that are very normalized and model for their students.
Absolutely. I've been seeing more faculty members playing with Twitch, at least reading about faculty members playing with that gaming streaming service, if you're unfamiliar with Twitch, to use for like office hours. Clearly, they need a better learning management system, but we can help them with that later. But if you're just joining us, welcome to Between Two Moose. I'm Chris Sessums, and I'm joined by Ken Chapman. And we're talking about student engagement today and ways that keep students engaged, especially this time of the semester. We're getting to that slog point. I know my son, who's in college right now, midterms were just happened, and they're doing everything in their power. Sam is doing everything in his power to stay engaged in his classes. He's just thinking at the end, So it really becomes important, I think, for teachers, if they want to keep students engaged and motivated, they really have to think about how they're doing that. One of the things that I know that I've read a lot about and tried in my own practice is active learning activities, ways to get students actively engaged in their learning process. And one of the ways that I like to do that is to ask students to take over moderation, for example, of the discussion forum.
Yep.
Right. So put students in charge, put them in the faculty member's seat, so that they recognize all the sort of steps they need that are involved in keeping students engaged. In other words, I love to share sort of the wealth instead of hoarding it all for myself.
Well, and that can be really powerful too. Like you say, Chris, if up front you've done that level setting and you've made those expectations clear, when we're farther along in the semester or the delivery, we have a better sense of how our students are tracking towards those expectations. So, you've got more opportunity to do things like, you've got some students that are really masters of certain areas and others that are weak, and you can give the opportunity for some mentorship relationships. And everybody is going to have a different strength and weakness profile. So there creates a lot of different opportunities for students to take on really differentiated roles rather than the binary student and instructor. And again, as we all know, when we've had to go and teach a subject, you have to be both comfortable with the material, but proficient with it to get somebody to engage with you.
No, absolutely. Another thing that I like to try to do in my courses is to try to keep students engaged, is to try to, from the outset, as you mentioned, is to create a learning community. A place where we're all working together. We all have shared goals and expectations, and we have a responsibility towards one another, which I find it takes a little practice for my students to get used to that. Oftentimes, they've been long distance runners in their online courses. They're just out there working on their own, and in some cases, their courses don't have that feeling of community and that we're all in this together. And I think by establishing that kind of expectation that, hey, this isn't about who crosses the finish line first. It's about the whole class. And if we work together that way, I found students to be their shoulders drop, and they're more willing to be engaged as well, which I think is kind of cool.
So double click on that for me, Chris, because I think that's something that a lot of people want to achieve, but it's hard to maybe imagine how to get there when you're working with a blank slate or really haven't achieved that before. What are some of the best practices you recommend?
Part of it is, as I mentioned earlier, is this idea of communicating clearly to your students what the expectations are for the class, and then modeling those expectations. So if I talk to students about working together, we need to sort of start together, working as a group, and modeling what that group work looks like. And then I feel more confident than turning the reins over to students and within their groups, so that they are able to work together and to try to create that sense of belonging and support for one another. It doesn't happen automatically. It does take practice. And, I was raised in a family that my father said something once, and that meant I had to get it. There was no repeating things. And when I first started teaching, that's how I approached teaching. I'll just say this once and you better get it. And I quickly learned that doesn't work. So I found, again, I need to communicate what I'm expecting, and give students clear expectations and directions. And if I'm not doing that, then I can't expect to create a very deep, engaged community of learners.
Great. Well, and I know what I've seen is, once you start modeling some of that behavior, inevitably some of your students will start to really pick that up and in many cases be better modelers of that than the instructor themselves, and will come out with new ways to, support their classmates, share an idea, capture something from their own life and connect it and contextualize it to what's happening in the classroom. So it's important to promote and advocate for those practices that you see from your students, so that they can get an idea of the exemplars that you're looking for, and some of those practices that you want to see modeled from their peers.
That's very true. Other things that I try to do to keep students engaged is, there's a lot of tools available to faculty within their learning management system. And I find that students really feel good when they know what's coming, right? So I use checklists, for example, on a regular basis to help students understand this is what's going to happen within these next 2 weeks. It keeps them on track, so that I don't get those questions of like, what are we supposed to do? And when is it due? And another thing that I love to do with students to keep them engaged is surveys and polls of my students to say, is the content that I'm teaching, is it sticking? Mm-hmm. Are there things that you don't understand that we need to dive a little deeper on? And especially at this time of year, right, where we're about midway through, this is a great opportunity for you to sort of survey your students and say, how are we doing?
Yeah.
Are the concepts in this course sticking? Is there things we need to review? Because we often move so fast through the term, it's important, I feel like, to stop, take a minute and go, okay, how are we doing? Kind of take a pulse check.
Yeah. I think that creates the opportunity for that a +1 sort of mindset. As you're polling your students and understanding, maybe it's conceptually, maybe it's delivery wise where they're struggling. You can look for that one area that maybe you want to make the material a little bit more interactive. Maybe you want to gamify it. Forgive the jargon term. Or maybe it's an opportunity, because it's a challenging concept, to create a couple different representations of how to communicate the idea and test knowledge around it, because it's sticky enough and core enough to what's going forward. But it's that closed loop of feedback. Engagement goes two ways. The faculty need to be engaged with what the students are experiencing and what's working for them, so they can feed back into their own processes, just like the students need to do that for their learning.
No, absolutely, Ken. And part of that I try to model through the use of announcements or an activity feed, so that each week I have an opportunity to say, here's what we covered over the last week. Here's some examples of work that I've seen from you, my students, that I think is really worth calling out. And students are waiting each week for me to, please call out my work, please recognize me. And so I try really hard to, even if it's not, let's say, aligned exactly to the academic goals of the class, if there's behaviors that I'm seeing in students or ways they're engaging other students, I like to call that out so that they can feel like, yes, he's listening, he's paying attention, and that motivates them to pay attention a little more as well. And I like what you're talking about gamifying. So just a real quick plug, our next Between Two Moves, we're going to be all about game and talking about gamification of learning as well. So you don't want to miss that for sure. But trying to find ways to support sort of cooperative learning opportunities, I think, really helps engagement. I hesitate to say group activities, but group activities can be really powerful as well in forms of engaging students. But it so much depends on how you structure those, so that people understand clearly what the expectation of their individual role in that group, so that we don't get to the end of the semester and the one student says, I did all the work for everybody, give them both Fs, give me the A. That always leads to bad blood, and I try to avoid that.
Absolutely.
So we are Between Two Moves. I'm Chris Sessums, and I'm joined by Ken Chapman. And we're about running out of time. Ken, are there any last thoughts that you have for folks here talking about student engagement?
I think it's just take a growth mindset and listen and be empathetic to your students. They're going to signal a lot of what is working for them and what's not. I mean, you have to listen a little harder online because you don't have the classroom where you can see the faces, the furrowed brows, and the nodding heads. But create those opportunities for feedback. And I truly believe with that +1 kind of mindset, continually refining and improving areas that your students are telling you are working or not for them is going to be effective. And talk to your peers. Some things that you do extremely well, some of your peers down the hallway may not be, and there's group learning that can happen between your peers and those that are all teaching students together. It's amazing what can be done in a community of educators with all of the wealth of experience at their hands and the different subject domains that they work in. That's
so true. And you just triggered something for me as well in your comments there. One of the things that my students always used to talk about is now I have to, full disclosure, I was a professor in the College of Education, so I'm teaching teachers. So this is really critical, right? I feel like everything that I'm modeling, I have to really live what I'm modeling, because I'm trying to prepare educators for the real world. But the thing that they always wanted, my students always wanted, is whatever activities we did, if you really want to keep me engaged, focus on real world applications of what you're doing. Why I'm not an engineer is because for me, mathematics was always presented in such a way that it was abstract.
Yep.
And I know now it was all about, I needed to memorize a whole bunch of stuff, and it would be applied down the road. But
you nailed it, Chris, right? Like watch anybody use their phone. They are creators. Yeah. They are creators. They are bringing their world and their environment into every expression of themselves. And when learning doesn't allow them to do that, they're disengaged. That's a step down from their. So that's so important to realize. Yeah.
You know, it's funny. One of the assignments, speaking of, I had an activity once with my students where I gave them a real wicked problem, a real wicked question. And I said, you've got 5 minutes to solve this wicked problem. And students were like, well, what do we do? Are we allowed to use our computers? Are we allowed to talk to one another? I said, no, you have to use your cell phone and you have to go contact somebody outside of this class. And so they're like, oh, this is great. You know, students are texting their moms and dads. They're texting their brothers, their friends, their colleagues, their brothers and sisters, and going, hey, help me. And they realized, wow, you mean I can use my phone in my classroom to help me solve problems? And I thought, yeah, I just wanted to see how you would respond to something like that. To your point, Ken, trying to use the real world tools we all use every day. I struggle, and I understand there's a lot of good reasons why we ask students to pack away their laptops and their phones when they come into the classroom. But on the other hand, I like to think of ways where, well, these are tools that students use every day. What ways can we help them use these tools to help them solve the problems that we do? I know I do on a regular basis. So why do I disallow my students from doing that?
Well said, sir. My fellow Moose, I'm sure we could talk all day long, but I think we're probably at time. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. Chris Sessums and myself, Ken Chapman, on Between Two Moose. We will return to talk about gamification.
Thanks, Ken.